This presentation is about Leamington's water supply, not the spa water, the ordinary stuff that comes out of your taps. Why history beneath your feet? It is because of these things, the ironwork in our roads and pavements, stopcock boxes, sluice valve boxes and the like. They tell a story and chronicle our past, and there is so much under our feet. Foul sewers, surface water sewers, telephone cables, electricity cables, gas pipes, not to mention TV cables. It is a wonder there is room for all the services buried under our urban roads. During the weeks that I have been preparing this talk, I've made a study of the ironwork in our roads and nearly got run over on a number of occasions. Manholes can be things of great beauty. Here's an example from Japan, and another. These two come from China and Berlin. The following pictures show how ironwork illustrates the history of the successive organisations which, over the years, have been responsible for our water supply. We have represented in ironwork this rather anonymous sluice valve box, which I guess to be from the Leamington Board of Health, Leamington Corporation Waterworks, South Warwickshire Water Board, Severn Trent Water Authority and Severn Trent Water Company. In 1831, when Leamington's population was around 6,000, the larger houses had their own wells. Poorer people may also have had a well in the garden, often located too near to the privy. Or they may have relied on a communal well or spring. The farmer at Newbold Common, situated at the end of Holly Walk, was one Thomas Oldham. He also was the proprietor of the mill on the River Lem, after which the mill gardens are named. In 1832 he promoted his own water supply system and supplied a number of houses in the Old Town with piped water. In 1833 he extended the mains into the New Town north of the river. The source of Oldham's water is uncertain. Some reports give it as a spring at the mill, some as a spring half a mile upstream on the north side of the river, and some as a culvert laid through the water meadows upstream of the mill. Whatever its source, water was pumped to a brick-lined open reservoir on Campion Hills, from whence it gravitated into supply. The chimney we see in the photograph was no doubt associated with the steam boiler which provided power for the pumps. So exactly where was Oldham's mill? The mill was near the junction of Mill Road and Lem Terrace, close to the Elephant Wash. Here is a recent photograph taken near the site of the mill. And this is a Google Earth view of the vicinity. The mill was about here. It is possible to see part of the foundation of the mill below the water. Just about here. And here's a closer view of the foundations. This photograph was taken when the mill was demolished in 1889. It would appear that Oldham's waterworks had no legal standing. It was not a water undertaking in the proper sense. Nevertheless, Mr. Oldham continued to supply water and to extend his mains in the streets. Indeed, the commissioners for the town contracted to buy water from him for street watering purposes. The Improvement Commissioners governed Leamington from 1825 to 1852. Their full title was the Paving, Lighting and Improvement Commissioners, and they were established by an Act of Parliament dated 1825. Some of their duties are evident from the title, and others included sewerage and water supply. It is easy to forget how important street watering was. Most roads and pavements were not paved as they are in this illustration, and watering was necessary, particularly in the summer, to keep down the dust. In 1847, the Commissioners contracted with Mr. Oldham to supply street watering water at a cost of 3 shillings and 3 pence per 1,000 gallons, a very high price. Potable water supplies seem to have taken second place as far as the Commissioners were concerned, even though it was known that many of the shallow wells on which most people depended were contaminated. However, the Commissioners did seek the advice of Thomas Hawksley, a notable civil engineer who had built Nottingham's Trent Bridge waterworks at the age of 23. His report to the Commissioners, dated July 1847, recommended the sinking of a well into the sandstone at Emscott. But he did say that the river water would be perfectly satisfactory if properly treated, and it would be cheaper. The well at Emscott was never dug. However, in 1849 the Commissioners decided to buy out Oldham, but on discovering that he only had the mill on leasehold, they purchased the distribution pipes and reservoir and contracted with him for the supply of water and steam power. Oldham Sr. died that year, and the contract was eventually between the Commissioners and his 2 sons. The cost of the pipes and the reservoir were agreed by arbitration at £6,392. 2 guineas a day was agreed for the purchase of power, and 1 shilling per day for up to 300,000 gallons, a far cry from the 3 shillings and 3 pence per 1,000 gallons for street watering. The mains and reservoir were in the hands of the Commissioners by January 1851. Despite the best efforts of the Commissioners, complaints about the quality of the water continued to pour in, and numerous reports were produced proposing what should be done about it. One of these reports proposed the construction of larger covered reservoirs on Campion Hills. So, in 1858, 2 circular brick reservoirs, each of 500,000 gallons capacity, were brought into use. They are cited here. And, to put things into perspective, here is the location of Oldham's Mill, the source of the water. The reservoirs continued in use until 1976, and this photograph was taken during maintenance works in 1957. They were skillfully constructed of blue brick and surrounded on the outside with a layer of clay. This was presumably on the basis that a certain amount of water would seep through the brickwork, but would go no further than the clay. I have been inside one of the reservoirs and can vouch for the skill of the bricklayers who built it. The reservoirs are still on Campion Hills, close by the TV mast. They are mostly buried, and there is not much to see from the outside, just a bit of a mound surrounded by wrought iron railings. I have often thought that they could be converted into a nightclub. Part of the deal with Messrs. Oldham was that they would construct a large open settling tank at the mill along with 2 sand filters. Thus, the water delivered to the new reservoirs would be of better quality. This plaque, of which I am the proud owner, was affixed to the wall of one of the reservoirs. I guess that there was a similar one in the other reservoir. It marks the level at which the reservoir contains 500,000 gallons, the amount which Messrs Oldham was contracted to supply each day. You will see that it refers to the local Board of Health. This is the body which took over the duties of the Improvement Commissioners in 1852. This notable character now enters our story. Alderman Henry Bright. He is like a knight in shining armour as far as Leamington's water supply is concerned. His contribution was recognised by the erection of this obelisk, which stands in Hamilton Terrace, just off the parade. The inscription reads, "Erected by public subscription to record the services of Alderman Henry Bright, to whose untiring exertions this town is indebted for its supply of pure water." Alderman Bright lived in an age when gentlemen with some leisure and money loved to engage in research. The letters pages of contemporary editions of the Times are full of erudite but amateur discussions on, for example, the merits of this steam engine as compared to that. By no means was research and development left to professionals. Henry Bright was very much of this age. He was a clock and watchmaker with premises in Charlotte Street and Lower Parade. As a member of the local Board of Health, he had had to deal with the many complaints about the town water supply. Messrs Oldham's maintenance of the rudimentary treatment plant at the mill left a lot to be desired. One resident complained about fish coming out of the tap. Also, towns and villages on the Lem upstream of Leamington were polluting the water. In 1873, the medical practitioners of the town presented a memorandum to the board saying that the river was not a proper source of water for the inhabitants. Henry Bright was of the opinion that the town should abandon the river and look for underground water. This is a photograph of part of a wonderfully detailed set of maps produced for the local Board of Health, principally to facilitate the first-time sewerage of Leamington. It shows the plot of land which Henry Bright persuaded the board to buy on which to dig a well. The pump house over the well, boiler room and superintendent's house had all been built by the time this survey was done. Only the superintendent's house is still standing today. An 8-inch diameter pilot well was sunk initially, followed in 1876 by a 20-foot diameter well, both to a depth of about 120 feet. A horizontal adit was driven to connect the two. You will notice that the heading of this slide has changed from Leamington Board of Health to Leamington Borough. This is because a charter of incorporation made Leamington a borough in 1875. Our hero, Henry Bright, continued to serve the town as a borough councillor, later an alderman. The supply from the well was ample, about 1.5 million gallons per day. This photo, taken in 1992, shows the pump house over the well. The chimney to the boiler house had, by 1992, been taken down. This plaque, just inside the main entrance, reads, "Borough of Royal Leamington Spa Corporation Waterworks, opened on March 11, 1879, by W. Harding Esquire, J.P., Mayor." Also mentioned are G.B. Jerram, engineer, and H. Young and Company, contractors of London. The works was opened with great ceremony, the mayor and corporation processing from the town hall to Campion Terrace. The contract with Messrs Oldham for the river water supply was terminated in May 1879. The Oldhams had thus provided water to the town for 47 years, an early example of PPI, public-private initiative, which was not too successful. Some would argue that we should have learnt from past mistakes. 2 pairs of 18-inch diameter bucket pumps with a 5-foot stroke were installed in the well. They were driven by 2 horizontal steam engines, one of which is seen in this picture. The engines were single-cylinder, double-acting, of 21-inch bore by 42-inch stroke, developing 75 horsepower at 40 revolutions per minute. One was named the Wackrell and the other the Harding, after members of the Water Committee. The flywheel was 12 feet in diameter and weighed 8 tons. Steam was supplied from 2 30-foot long by 7-foot diameter Lancashire-type boilers working at 60 pounds per square inch pressure, housed in an adjacent building. It was not long before the yield of Campion Terrace well started to decline. By 1885 the population of the town had risen to 23,000, and the borough surveyor was reporting that the consumption was 900,000 gallons per day, and that the rest water level in the well had dropped from the original 60 feet above well bottom to 28 feet. To ease matters, in 1887 a steam-driven pump was installed in an extension to the Royal Pump Rooms to draw water for street watering. This attractive picture hangs in the Pump Rooms Museum and shows the pumping house to the left of the main building. The chimney serves the boilers and it can be clearly seen. Here is a recent photo of the building which once served as the pumping station, the chimney having been demolished long ago. Raw water mains were laid alongside the existing treated water ones, and Leamington became one of the few towns in the country to have a dual system. Using untreated river water for street watering obviously reduced the consumption of potable water from Campion Terrace well. At this point in our story, I can introduce you to one of the rarest sluice valve boxes I have come across. This one is emblazoned with the initials LSC, Leamington Spa Corporation of course, but then RWV standing for raw water valve. Now the raw water system was abandoned in the 1970s, so this box is over a redundant valve. Another rare box, this one marked TW, standing for treated water, to differentiate the valve from one on the raw water system. As mentioned, the raw water supply system had continued in use up until the 70s, obviously no longer for street watering, but for garden watering and firefighting. It was abandoned mainly because of confusion between the raw water mains with the treated water ones. They were all cast iron and looked identical. Properties were occasionally connected to the raw water main, and the mistake would come to light when the occupants complained about dirty water coming from the taps. Potentially very hazardous, of course. The introduction of the raw water system certainly relieved the situation, but a growing population and increasing demand, some houses were actually being built with bathrooms, meant that Leamington was soon looking for more water. Oldham and Bright was again in the vanguard. A service reservoir had already been constructed in 1894 on a piece of land cornered by Southview Road and Cubbington Road in Leamington. Alderman Bright proposed putting down a well adjacent to the reservoir. It was only 2,000 yards from Campion Terrace Well and would exploit the same aquifer, but the advice was that the proposed well would not adversely affect the old one. The site of the proposed well was some 70 feet above Campion Terrace, and thus it would have to be dug deeper. I had great difficulty finding a photograph of the pumping station over Leamington Well, which, as it was only demolished relatively recently, is surprising. All I was able to find was this wartime photograph showing the bomb damage in Telford Avenue. The pumping station is in the background. Here it is with its water storage tank on the roof. However, I gave this talk to Leamington History Group, and one of their members, Paul Wells, came up with this, which only goes to show the value of networking with fellow historians. This gives a better view of the pumping station. By now, gas engines had been developed which ran off the town gas supply. Thus it was no longer necessary to raise steam in boilers which needed stoking 24 hours a day. The resultant reduction in manpower was very significant. The pump was still of the old reciprocating bucket type. This is a picture of a gas engine similar to the one installed at Leamington Well. The well was put into production with great ceremony in September 1900. The pump house was a substantial structure, and the water tank on its roof could be brought into use if extra pressure was required for firefighting purposes. As mentioned, the original pump house was demolished in the 1990s and the service reservoir taken out of service. Most of the site was given over to housing, but the well is still in production and is in this position. Such are the advances in technology. All that is required on the surface is what you see here. The gas engine and the bucket type pump have been replaced with submersible electric pumps, and all the control gear is housed in the kiosk you see. An interesting anecdote relating to Leamington Well tells of a collapse of the shaft whilst it was being dug. An unexpected seam of running sand was encountered and had to be held back with timbering. The timbers were not strong enough and collapsed into the shaft along with hundreds of tons of sand. Alderman Bright, who up to this point in my researches had been a hero of mine, remarked during a meeting of the town council that it was fortunate that no labourers were in the well at the time of the collapse, because it would have cost £50 to £60 to bring their dead bodies out. This is quite true. You can read about it in the Leamington Courier of the time. Before we continue our story, I want to tell you about a real gem which I discovered at the County Records Office. It is a notebook kept by the then borough engineer, William de Normanville. It contains everything you need to know to run Leamington at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, from how much hay a horse needs to the hours worked by lamplighters. Indeed, the position of each gas street lamp is listed. The connection with Leamington Well is this. The advert I found inside the notebook for an engine driver to take up duties at the brand new works. The advert reads, "The plant for which a driver is wanted consists of a set of 3-throw lift pumps, 21-inch by 10-inch, working at a depth of 140 feet below the engine house floor, in a well 170 feet deep. The pumps are driven by belting from a gas engine of 42 horsepower. Work hours are from 6 AM to 6 PM with half an hour off for breakfast and 1 hour for dinner and the wages are 40 shillings per week. There will be no work on Saturday afternoons or Sundays, except in times of drought, when the pumps must be run for the whole of Saturday and for 5 hours on Sunday. Also in the notebook is this reference to the wages of a man named Atkins, a labourer at Campion Terrace. He was paid 25 shillings for a 70-hour week, with 4.35 pence per hour paid for overtime. I was interested to see the use of decimal parts of a penny rather than it being expressed as a fraction. The lucky man got 3 days holiday a year with pay, and his pay was enhanced when the superintendent, Mr. Buckley, was off and he had full charge of the engine house. Also, he received extra pay for unsocial hours, 1.5 times normal pay for night shift, 9 p.m. to 6 a.m, also time and a half for Sundays. It is important not to underestimate the part which working horses played in keeping municipal services running at the turn of the century. Mr. de Normanville details in his notebook the amount of feed each horse needs per week. Oats £38, beans £24, bran £50. Oats and beans to be crushed and kibbled at the Adelaide depot, then the above weights in separate sacks with as much chaff as required to be sent to Milverton depots each week. The horsekeeper worked exceedingly long hours. Weekdays from 5 a.m. to 8 a.m, then a break until 9:30 a.m, working until 1 p.m, another break, and then 2:30 p.m. to 7 p.m. And on Sundays he got a lie-in until 7 a.m. and worked till 9:30 a.m, then again from 12 a.m. to 1 p.m, and from 5 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. If he was required to work beyond these hours, and I calculate these hours represent a 71-hour week, he would be paid at time and a quarter. It is not recorded when the poor man was expected to sleep. The one constant in the business of providing water supplies is that demand is continually outstripping supply. This was true in 1902, when a water turbine and a set of pumps were installed in the abutment of the newly built Mill Weir to supplement the raw water supply. 9,700 gallons per hour could be abstracted with this setup. In 1926, the steam-driven raw water pump at the pump rooms was taken out of service. In its place, electrically driven pumps were installed in a new pump house adjacent to Mill Weir, near where the new restaurant now stands. This had the advantage that water could be drawn from the river upstream and downstream of the weir. During the first quarter of the 20th century, attempts were made to maintain the output of Campion Terrace well by extending the adits, but the water rest level continued to fall, indicating that abstraction rates were greater than the natural recharge of the aquifer. Leamington well was deepened to 242 feet and adits were driven in 1908. In 1934, Leamington Brewery closed and was purchased by the borough. The well that had fed the brewery was 8 feet diameter by 91 feet deep and produced 120,000 gallons per day. The water was pumped into the public mains and the brewery became a council depot. The war years put further strain on Leamington's water supplies due to the influx of refugees from Coventry and increased industrial production. A borehole at Leicester Lane was brought into production, supplementing supplies to the extent of 100,000 gallons per day. The advent of submersible electric pumps meant that small diameter boreholes were now possible in place of large diameter wells. Leicester Lane borehole was in use until the late 1970s, when it became contaminated from a road de-icing stockpile and had to be abandoned. But when Leamington's population rose by 40% during the war years, ingenious emergency measures had to be implemented. Underground sources were already fully exploited. The only answer was to look again at the River Lem for potable water. It was fortunate that Leamington's raw water mains system enabled river water to be delivered to Campion Terrace. There was room at the site of the well to build settling tanks and pressure filters. This photo and the previous one are of later settling tanks and filters, not the ones which were installed under the defence regulations, but please forgive a bit of historical licence. In 1956, the steam power used to pump from the well was abandoned and electrically driven submersible pumps were installed. So, it is now the 1950s and time to recap on Leamington's water supply. The principal source is still Campion Terrace Well, backed up with further underground sources at Leamington, the old brewery and Leicester Lane. Increasing reliance is being put on water taken from the Lem at Mill Weir and treated at Campion Terrace. Surface water storage is provided at Campion Hills and Leamington. Untreated river water is still available in a second set of mains for horticultural, industrial and firefighting use. In 1957, the need for additional service reservoir storage was recognised, and a 2 million gallon reinforced concrete reservoir was built at Campion Hills. A few years later, the Campion Hills Treatment Works was to be built on the same site. Water was delivered to the reservoir via a new 21-inch diameter rising main from Campion Terrace. A pump was installed at the reservoir to provide water to Southam Rural District Council's northern parishes. It is always a dicey business taking water directly from a river. The river can become polluted, and at times of low flow there may not be enough water to abstract. Always better to have the backup of bankside storage. Also, retention in a reservoir gives sediment a chance to settle, making subsequent treatment simpler. Thus it was that in 1960-61 Wills Meadow Reservoir and pumping station was built. It provided 21 million gallons of storage. The pumps delivered to the treatment works at Campion Terrace through a new 15-inch diameter main. The reservoir embankments were formed of soil excavated locally with a core of clay. The clay on the south side of the river was found to be of poor quality, but good stuff was found on the river's north bank. A Bailey bridge was constructed over the river and the clay carried across. Here is the pumping station under construction. It houses two sets of pumps, one to draw water from the river and deliver it to the new bankside reservoir, the second to deliver water from that reservoir to Campion Terrace. A few years later, when Campion Hills Treatment Works was built, enough room was found to install additional pumps which would deliver reservoir water to that new works. I know all about that because I was the engineer who designed the additional pumps and pipework. There was about to be a major change in the organisation which provided water to Leamington. Leamington Corporation Waterworks, which had supplied the town for 88 years, would hand over to another body. The South Warwickshire Water Board. For some years, Leamington and its neighbours had recognised the need to cooperate over water supplies. Leamington provided water to Warwick and, as previously mentioned, water to Southam Rural District Council. Discussions initiated by my old boss, Leamington's Borough Engineer Cecil Innes-Jones, started about the possibility of forming a water board. In 1963, the boroughs of Leamington, Warwick and Stratford-upon-Avon, the Urban District Council of Kenilworth and the rural districts of Shipston-on-Stour, Southam, Stratford and Warwick came together to form South Warwickshire Water Board. This display was mounted in the main entrance of Campion Hills Treatment Works to show the area covered by the board. But in our story we haven't quite got to the building of this works. I was hoping to put together a slideshow showing the stopcock boxes of each of the small undertakings melding together to form one South Warwickshire Water Board box. Two problems: I was not clever enough, and I could only find examples of three of the constituent undertakings: Stratford-upon-Avon Corporation Water Department, Leamington Corporation Waterworks, and the Corporation of Warwick Water Department. I have searched for the others, but it is quite possible that small undertakings like Kenilworth Urban District Council never went to the expense of having bespoke boxes made. They simply used generic, unmarked ones from the foundry. Suffice it to say that the undertakings represented here, along with others, came together to form the South Warwickshire Water Board. I mentioned Campion Hills Treatment Works. It was built as part of a major scheme promoted jointly by South Warwickshire Water Board and Rugby Water Board. It was ambitious in scale. For years the amount which could be taken from the River Lem in the summer was severely restricted because of low flows. Wills Meadow Reservoir only held a few days' supply. To overcome this, water would be abstracted from the Lem at Ethorpe during the winter, when water was plentiful, and pumped to a massive new 5,000 million gallon reservoir at Draycote. Water was to be released back into the Lem at times of low flow so that it could be abstracted at Wills Meadow, and it would be treated at this brand new works at Campion Hills, shown under construction here. Rugby would also take a pipe supply from Draycote to be treated at their Avon treatment works. Here is another shot of the treatment works under construction. So the whole scheme involved building the abstraction works at Ethorpe, Draycote Reservoir and Campion Hills Treatment Works. As already mentioned, additional pumps were installed in the pump house at Wills Meadow to deliver raw water to Campion Hills via a new raw water main. Water from Campion Hills Treatment Works would be pumped to a new service reservoir at Red Lane, Kenilworth, to supplement that town's supplies. The capacity of the treatment works was 4 million gallons per day. Work was completed in June 1969. Back to my beloved stopcock boxes. South Warwickshire Water Board achieved an awful lot in its 10 years of existence. In 1973, the government decided that regionalisation of water services was required. Not only that, but a single authority would become responsible for both clean and dirty water services. So the water authorities were formed, still an arm of government, with nominated councillors making up the board. In our area, we came under the Severn Trent Water Authority. This poster shows the huge Severn Trent region stretching from Gloucester to Humberside. It is important to remember that we have had private water companies in England for many years. In our area we have the long-standing East Worcestershire and the South Staffordshire water companies, and they were unaffected by the 1973 regionalisation. So within the red border shown here there were enclaves which did not belong to Severn Trent as far as clean water was concerned. Severn Trent did, however, provide sewerage and sewage disposal services across the entire region. In 1979, Maggie Thatcher came to power and started her programme of privatisations. It took her 10 years to get around to water, and in 1989 the water authorities became water companies. A small enough change in name from Severn Trent Water Authority to Severn Trent Water Company, but a complete change of ownership. We were right back to where we were in 1832 when water was supplied by Thomas Oldham's Water Company. Well, not quite. In the interim there had been a huge investment of public money and the industry was in good heart. Private investors would now reap the benefit. However, Severn Trent Water Company continues to pay my pension and, unlike several of their fellow water companies, they are still British owned. There has only been one major change to Leamington's water supply in recent years. Rather than delivering Draycote water to Willsmeadow via the river, there is now a pipe laid for the purpose. Thus, water which has received the benefit of a certain amount of clarification in Draycote Reservoir does not have to get dirty again as it travels to Leamington. And the capacity of Campion Hill's treatment works has been increased from 4 to 5.7 million gallons per day. River water has not been treated at Campion Terrace since 1987. More recently, most of the above-ground buildings and plant were removed, and a large part of the site was sold for housing development. All that remains is the wellhead and kiosks housing the switchgear and controls. And that brings the story to a close. Don't forget to look for history beneath your feet. It can enhance the enjoyment of any urban walk, even spice up your foreign holidays. And who knows, you may find your own name preserved in cast iron, even if they do get the initials wrong. I am indebted to all the people listed on this slide. Before I go, I want to set some homework. This is the hen's teeth of stopcock boxes, so rare that I have only ever seen one. It was rather worn, but the initials are unmistakable, LBW, which, as I saw it in Leamington, I take to be Leamington Borough Water, not the usual and very common LCW, Leamington Corporation Water. Unfortunately, I did not make a note of its location, and I have been unable to find it again. So, if you find yourselves walking the streets of Leamington, or indeed any other part of Leamington, keep your eyes open, and if you see an LBW, remember the cricketing term, note where it is, and let me know. Bye-bye.